Did you already drink the tea?
The question froze Duchess Isolde Renmere halfway across the bedroom. She turned slowly toward the doorway. Duke Leontius Veilcrest stood there, holding his gloves in one hand, snow melting across the shoulders of his black coat. His voice sounded calm, gentle, but something about the question felt wrong.
No.
Isolde answered softly. For a brief second, the Duke looked relieved. Then he smiled again.
Good. You should drink it while it's still warm.
The fire crackled between them. Outside, snowstorm winds howled around Blackmere Castle. Leontius walked toward his wife slowly before lifting the porcelain teacup from the table beside her. The same routine, every single night.
You've been forgetting things again,
he said quietly. Isolde lowered her eyes.
I know.
You frightened the servants this morning.
I don't remember this morning. And somehow that hurt more.
The Duke's expression softened instantly, and somehow that hurt more.
You exhaust yourself trying to remember.
And kissed her forehead, exactly the way he had done since the beginning of their marriage. That was what terrified Isolde most, not cruelty, tenderness, because 3 years earlier, Duke Leontius Veilcrest had been the love of her life. He danced with her alone after aristocratic dinners. He carried her gloves during winter carriage rides, and every single night before bed, he personally brought her tea. But lately, strange things had been happening. Missing memories, whispers from servants, bruises she could not explain, entire conversations disappearing from her mind. Sometimes Isolde genuinely wondered whether she was losing herself. Until one night, Duchess Isolde Renmere noticed dark sediment resting quietly at the bottom of the teacup, and suddenly everything changed. Now, standing beside the fire while her husband watched her carefully, the Duchess stared silently at the tea in her hands. Then slowly, very slowly, she smiled, because Duke Leontius Veilcrest still believed his wife drank the tea every night. What he did not know was that for the past 3 months, Duchess Isolde Renmere had poured every single cup into the fireplace after he left the room, and replaced it with plain water, and pretended every single night. Which meant something impossible had begun happening inside Blackmere Castle. The poison meant for the Duchess had slowly begun destroying the Duke instead. And tonight, for the very first time, Leontius Veilcrest was beginning to realize it. Before we continue, tell us in the comments, at what moment would you stop trusting someone you love? And don't forget to like and subscribe, because this story only gets darker from here. Duchess Isolde Renmere kept her eyes closed while the voices drifted through the bedroom doorway.
She barely remembers anything now.
The words were followed by silence, then the low voice of Duke Leontius Veilcrest.
Lower your voice.
I'm only saying the treatment is working faster than expected.
Isolde's fingers tightened slightly beneath the blanket. Treatment. The word echoed strangely inside her head. Outside the windows of Blackmere Castle, winter winds dragged snow across the dark cliffs surrounding the estate. The fire beside the bed burned low, filling the room with the scent of cedar wood and melted candle wax. Somewhere farther down the corridor, servants moved quietly through the castle, preparing for the night. Then the bedroom door opened softly. Isolde forced her breathing to remain slow and heavy. She felt her husband approach the bed. For several seconds he said nothing. Then his fingers brushed gently across her hair. "She's sleeping," he murmured. Not long afterward, the room fell silent again. But even after the footsteps disappeared, sleep never returned to her, because hearing those words awakened a memory she had spent months trying not to question. 3 years earlier, before Blackmere Castle became a place of whispers and locked doors, Isolde met Duke Leontius Veilcrest during a winter gala in London. Snow had covered the city that evening, turning the streets outside Ashbourne Hall silver beneath gas lamps and carriage lights. Inside the ballroom, music drifted through enormous crystal chandeliers, while aristocrats laughed over champagne and polished silver trays filled with smoked salmon, roasted pheasant, cream pastries, and sugared fruits. Isolde remembered feeling completely out of place. Her family still carried title and respect, but the Renmere fortune had faded long ago. Compared to the jeweled women surrounding ministers and noblemen that night, she felt painfully ordinary in her dark blue gown. Then Duke Leontius Veilcrest entered the ballroom. Conversation softened almost immediately. People watched him the way people watched storms rolling across the sea. Tall, composed, and impossibly controlled, the Duke moved through the crowd with quiet confidence. Older politicians greeted him carefully. Young women lowered their eyes whenever he looked in their direction. Yet out of everyone inside the ballroom, he approached Isolde. "You're freezing," he said, after noticing her standing near the balcony doors. Before she could answer, he removed his gloves and placed them gently into her hands. That small gesture stayed with her long after the night ended. Their courtship moved quickly afterward. Flowers arrived
they're
every morning at
beautiful,
the
thank
Renmere
you.
estate. Long handwritten
They
letters
smell
followed whenever the Duke
wonderful.
traveled for business.
Not as wonderful
Sometimes
as
he
you.
appeared unexpectedly, simply to spend an hour walking beside her through snowy gardens. No man had ever looked at Isolde the way Leontius did during those early months, not with hunger, with attention, as though every word she spoke mattered. The wedding took place the following autumn beneath cathedral bells and endless rain. Newspapers across England praised the union for weeks afterward, calling Isolde the Rose of Blackmere. And when she first arrived at Blackmere Castle as Duchess, the villagers lined the roads waiting to see her carriage pass. The estate itself looked like something pulled from old paintings. Massive stone towers overlooked frozen lakes and dark forests stretching for miles beyond the cliffs. Inside, the castle glowed with fireplaces, candle-lit halls, velvet curtains, polished oak staircases, and walls lined with portraits of the Veilcrest bloodline. But despite its size, somehow Leontius made the place feel warm, at least in the beginning. During winter evenings, they sat together near the library fireplace while snow fell outside the tall windows. He read quietly while Isolde rested against his shoulder, listening to the crackling wood and distant wind beyond the glass. Sometimes, after formal dinners ended and the servants disappeared upstairs,
To another
Leontius
room, my
guided
love.
her into the empty ballroom and
Lead
danced
on.
with her slowly beneath candlelight, while orchestral music still echoed softly through the hall. Those nights became her favorite memories, especially the carriage ride. Whenever estate business forced the Duke into nearby villages, Isolde insisted on accompanying him. They traveled through snow-covered roads, wrapped in thick blankets, while horses pulled the black carriage past cottages, glowing with lantern light. Villagers greeted them warmly wherever they stopped. Children ran beside the carriage, laughing. Women admired the Duchess openly. Men respected the Duke. And whenever someone praised her kindness, Leontius always looked proud. That was why Isolde ignored the first signs something had changed. At first, it was only distance, longer silences during dinner, missed conversations, moments where the Duke seemed distracted even while looking directly at her. Then came the accident. Rain hammered the castle windows that night, while Isolde crossed the east staircase, searching for her husband after dinner. She remembered hearing footsteps behind her near the landing. Then sudden dizziness. Her hand slipped against the railing, the world spun violently, and the staircase disappeared beneath her. When Duchess Isolde Renmere finally opened her eyes again 3 days later, candlelight flickered across the bedroom ceiling. Her entire body ached. The room smelled faintly of medicine, and beside the bed, Duke Leontius Veilcrest sat watching her with an expression she had never seen before. Not grief, not relief, something colder, something careful. The weeks following the accident passed through Blackmere Castle like slow-moving winter fog. At first, Isolde blamed the pain medicine for the strange distance growing between her and her husband. The doctors insisted recovery from a head injury often affected memory, emotions, and sleep. Even ordinary conversations exhausted her now. Sometimes she entered rooms without remembering why she had gone there in the first place. Still, none of that frightened her as much as the change in Leontius. Before the accident, he had touched her constantly without thinking about it, a hand resting against her back while they walked, fingers brushing her wrist during dinner, quiet kisses against her temple whenever he passed her in the library. Now every movement between them felt measured, careful, as though he was handling something fragile rather than speaking to his wife. One snowy evening, Isolde stood before the mirror inside her dressing room, wearing the dark emerald gown Leontius once called his favorite. The silk clung softly around her waist, while candlelight reflected against the gold embroidery near her sleeves. Months earlier, he would have crossed an entire ballroom just to pull her into his arms wearing that dress. Tonight, he barely looked up from the papers spread across his desk. "You look beautiful," he said absently. The words landed heavily because they sounded automatic, not felt. Isolde smiled anyway and joined him near the fire, while servants placed roasted duck, buttered potatoes, warm bread, and red wine across the dining table. Snow tapped softly against the windows as musicians played quietly somewhere deeper inside the castle. She tried speaking about the village school she planned to visit the following week. Leontius interrupted gently.
Believes too much activity may worsen your condition.
I feel stronger lately.
You felt stronger the morning you fell down the staircase.
His tone remained calm, but the conversation died immediately afterward. That became their new pattern. Every attempt at closeness somehow returned to her accident, her health, her memory, her supposed fragility. Weeks later, on the anniversary of their wedding, Isolde organized a private dinner herself inside the western dining room overlooking the frozen cliffs beyond Blackmere Castle. She chose his favorite wine personally and instructed the kitchen to prepare smoked venison with rosemary, cream soup, baked apples, and almond pastries exactly the way he liked them during their first year together. Candles covered the table. Music drifted softly through the room. She waited nearly 3 hours. By midnight, the food had gone cold. Finally, a servant entered quietly with lowered eyes.
His Grace sent word from town. Estate business delayed his return.
Thank you. You may go.
Isolde dismissed the servant politely before staring at the untouched dinner alone. Outside, snow buried the castle gardens in white silence. For the first time since their marriage began, she cried without allowing herself to make a sound. The strangest part was that Leontius never became openly cruel. That almost would have been easier. Instead, he became unbearably attentive in all the wrong ways. He reminded her to rest, asked whether she remembered taking her medicine, spoke softly whenever she seemed overwhelmed. At night, he adjusted blankets carefully around her shoulders before leaving for his study. Sometimes, servants watched them with admiration. They saw devotion. She felt distance. Then the memory lapses worsened. One afternoon, Isolde found herself standing inside the castle greenhouse, unable to remember how long she had been there. Another morning, she woke wearing a different nightgown than the one she remembered putting on before sleep. Twice she misplaced letters and later discovered them folded neatly inside drawers she never used. The confusion unsettled her deeply. When she mentioned it to Leontius, he listened with heartbreaking patience. "These things happen after trauma," he assured her gently. Then, a few nights later, he introduced the tea. The tray arrived just before bed, carried by the Duke himself. Steam curled from the porcelain cup, while the scent of chamomile and something faintly sweet filled the room.
The physician prepared this specially. It should help you sleep peacefully.
Thank you, Leontius. I appreciate
At first, Isolde appreciated the gesture. The tea relaxed her almost immediately. Warmth spread through her body after only a few sips, softening the constant tension inside her mind. She slept deeply for the first time in weeks afterward. The next night, he brought it again, and the night after that. Soon it became routine. Every evening, at precisely the same hour, Duke Leontius Veilcrest entered their chambers carrying the silver tray himself. He waited beside the fireplace while Isolde drank, watching her with quiet concentration. Sometimes he stroked her hair afterward. Sometimes he kissed her forehead softly before taking the empty cup away. The tenderness should have comforted her. Instead, it slowly began feeling strange, too careful, too deliberate. And though she hated herself for thinking it, there were moments that his attention during those nightly rituals unsettled her more than his distance ever had. One freezing afternoon, Isolde crossed the servants' corridor, searching for a misplaced shawl, when voices drifted quietly through the laundry room doorway. She frightened Mrs. Bennet again yesterday. The poor woman barely remembers conversations anymore. A second voice lowered further. The Duchess is losing her mind. Isolde stopped walking instantly. The blood drained from her face. Inside the laundry room, the maids continued whispering softly, unaware she stood only steps away, listening to every word.
After overhearing the servants whispering about her, Isolde stopped walking through Blackmere Castle with confidence. Every hallway suddenly felt unfamiliar. Every glance from the staff carried hidden meaning. At breakfast, she caught servants lowering their eyes too quickly whenever she entered the room. During dinner conversations, pauses lingered longer than before. Even ordinary mistakes began frightening her. Once, she forgot the name of a longtime groundskeeper who had worked at Blackmere since before her marriage, and the shame followed her for the rest of the day. The worst moments came at night. Several times, Isolde woke in strange places without understanding how she got there. One freezing morning, she opened her eyes inside the castle library, curled beneath the blanket near the dying fireplace. Another night, she woke sitting beside the window in her dressing robe while snow fell outside the glass. She had no memory of leaving bed. At first, she tried hiding these incidents from Leontius, but the confusion became impossible to ignore. One afternoon, while changing clothes, Isolde noticed bruises darkening the inside of her wrist. Faint purple marks, shaped almost like fingerprints, rested against her pale skin. She stared at them for a long time. Nothing inside her memory explained how they appeared there. That evening, she covered them beneath her sleeves before dinner. Leontius noticed anyway. "You've hurt yourself again," he said softly. Again, the word unsettled her. "I don't remember doing this." The Duke reached across the table and touched her hand carefully. The doctor warned these episodes may worsen before they improve. His calmness made her feel even smaller, more uncertain. Soon afterward, her younger sister Morwenna arrived unexpectedly at Blackmere Castle, carrying winter roses and a basket filled with fresh bread, jam, sugared walnuts, and lemon cakes from London. Unlike most people, Morwenna never looked comfortable around aristocrats. She moved through the enormous castle stiffly, observing everything too carefully. During lunch, she watched the servants more than the food, and she noticed things immediately. How quiet the staff became around the Duke, how often Leontius answered questions directed at Isolde, how gently he corrected her memory whenever she hesitated during conversation. That night, Morwenna entered Isolde's chambers while snow drifted softly beyond the windows.
You look exhausted. I'm fine. No, you aren't.
Isolde sat silently near the fireplace, twisting the fabric of her nightgown between trembling fingers.
I forget things constantly now. Sometimes entire afternoons disappear.
Morwenna's expression tightened.
And the doctor believes this is normal? After a head injury, perhaps it is.
Her sister looked around the room carefully before lowering her voice further.
Something feels wrong inside this castle.
My husband would never hurt me.
I didn't say he
Isolde
would.
reacted instantly. The words came too fast, too defensive. Even she noticed it. Morwenna stared at her sadly. Isolde remained awake long afterward thinking about the conversation, because deep inside herself, doubt had already started growing. Only she refused to name it. The following days became harder emotionally. Her memory lapses increased. Once she forgot attending breakfast entirely until a servant described what she had eaten earlier that morning. Another afternoon, she discovered muddy shoes near her bed, despite never remembering leaving the castle. Meanwhile, Leontius remained endlessly patient. That almost made everything worse. Whenever confusion overwhelmed her, he comforted her gently. Whenever she became frightened, he soothed her calmly. And every single night, he brought the tea. One evening, after hearing servants whisper again outside the corridor, Isolde finally broke down, crying in front of him. "They think I'm unstable," she whispered through tears. Leontius sat beside her immediately. "You must stop listening to frightened gossip." "What if they're right?" asked Isolde shakily. "What if something is truly wrong with me?" The Duke brushed tears carefully from her face. "There is nothing wrong with you." His voice sounded warm enough for her to cry harder. Then he handed her the porcelain cup. "Drink," he murmured softly. "You'll sleep better tonight." Still trembling emotionally, Isolde lifted the tea toward her lips, and for the first time she noticed something strange. Dark sediment rested quietly near the bottom of the cup, tiny grains, almost invisible beneath the steam. Her heartbeat slowed instantly. "What is it?" Leontius asked. "Nothing." She forced herself to smile before taking a small sip anyway. The taste seemed slightly bitter tonight, different. Afterward, the Duke kissed her forehead gently and disappeared into his study as usual. But Isolde remained frozen beside the fire, staring down into the teacup long after he left. The sediment still lingered there, dark, unmoving. Slowly she stood and crossed toward the mirror near her dressing table. For several seconds she simply stared at herself. Pale skin, tired eyes, a woman who no longer recognized her own thoughts. Then her gaze lowered toward the teacup again. Suddenly, memories rushed through her mind at once. The dizziness, the missing conversations, the bruises, the whispers, the way Leontius watched her drink every single night. Fear spread coldly through her chest. Not fear of madness, fear of understanding. Without allowing herself time to think further, Isolde walked to the fireplace, then slowly poured the tea into the flames. The liquid hissed sharply against burning wood. For several seconds, she stood completely still, listening to the sound. Then she refilled the cup carefully with plain water from the bedside pitcher. Her hands trembled so violently, she nearly spilled it across the floor. Afterward, she lifted the cup toward her lips and pretended to drink while staring at her reflection in the mirror. And in the silence of Blackmere Castle, Duchess Isolde Renmere whispered the thought she had been too terrified to admit until now. What if he's doing this to me?
The next morning, Isolde behaved exactly the same. That was the most difficult part. She forced herself to move slowly through breakfast while pretending exhaustion still weighed heavily on her mind. When Leontius asked whether she remembered speaking with the cook the previous evening, she lowered her eyes and shook her head apologetically. "I don't think so." The Duke studied her for a moment before nodding calmly. "It's better not to strain yourself." Then he reached across the table and poured tea into her cup himself. From that moment forward, the performance began. Every evening, Isolde waited until Leontius left their chambers before emptying the sleeping tea into the fireplace. Afterward, she filled the porcelain cup with water and placed it back exactly where he expected to find it in the morning. Then she pretended. Some days she acted distracted during conversation. Other times, she intentionally repeated questions or paused as though searching for memories that refused to return. Whenever servants spoke to her, she occasionally hesitated before answering, allowing uncertainty to soften her voice. The strange thing was how quickly Leontius relaxed. The tension that had quietly lived inside him for months began fading. He smiled more during dinner. He corrected her forgetfulness gently instead of watching her carefully. Several times, she even caught relief crossing his face after she pretended confusion over simple details. That frightened her more than anger would have, because now she understood he wanted her weak. So Isolde watched him instead, really watched him.
Once her fear settled into clarity, the atmosphere inside Blackmere Castle changed completely. She began noticing things previously hidden beneath love and confusion. Servants feared the Duke, not respected him, feared him. Whenever Leontius entered a room, conversations stopped instantly. Staff members lowered their eyes too quickly. Even older workers who had served the estate for decades became visibly tense around him. One afternoon, Isolde passed two footmen standing near the wine cellar. They were speaking quietly until the Duke appeared unexpectedly from the corridor behind them. The younger servant nearly dropped the crate in his hands. Leontius said nothing cruel. He merely looked at them. Yet both men immediately apologized as though expecting punishment. That silent fear stayed with Isolde. Then she noticed the first signs of change in Leontius himself. Small things at first. During breakfast, he repeated the same question twice within minutes. Another evening, he misplaced estate documents before accusing a servant of moving them, only to discover the papers inside his own study drawer later. One night, while discussing repairs to the northern stables, he suddenly stopped speaking mid-sentence and stared blankly toward the fire, as though trying to recover a thought that escaped him. The poison. The realization settled heavily inside Isolde. He had begun drinking it himself. Still, she needed proof before allowing herself to believe the full truth. The opportunity arrived during a stormy afternoon while Leontius traveled into town for a state business. Rain hammered the castle windows while most servants remained occupied downstairs,
lanterns are lit,
preparing
ma'am.
for visiting guests.
Good.
For
Check
the
the
first
windows.
time since their marriage, Isolde entered the Duke's private study without permission. The room smelled of leather, tobacco, and old paper. Shelves lined with financial ledgers covered the walls, while heavy curtains blocked most of the gray afternoon light outside. His desk remained perfectly organized, except for several medical invoices stacked near the corner. Isolde searched carefully. At first, she found nothing unusual beyond estate records and correspondence. Then she discovered the locked drawer. Inside rested several folded documents tied neatly with dark ribbon. Medical reports, not hers. A woman named Lenora Vailcrest appeared repeatedly throughout the papers. Her pulse quickened while reading descriptions of symptoms. Memory instability, confusion,
reports,
disturbed
not
sleep,
mine.
episodes of emotional
Lenora
distress,
Valcrest, her
heavy
name is
sedation
everywhere.
recommended
Memory
nightly.
instability,
The words felt
confusion,
horrifyingly
disturbed
familiar. Her hands began trembling. Who was Lenora? Then, beneath the records, Isolde discovered an old photograph. A younger Leontius stood beside a dark-haired woman wearing a pale winter coat near the frozen gardens of Blackmere Castle. The resemblance between the woman and Isolde unsettled her instantly. Written carefully across the back were 4 simple words: "My beloved Lenora, winter 1971. Beloved, not cousin, not family friend, beloved." Footsteps echoed suddenly somewhere beyond the corridor. Isolde barely managed to return everything before leaving the study, moments before a servant passed nearby carrying firewood. That evening, during dinner, the photograph remained trapped inside Isolde's mind. Leontius sat across from her, cutting roasted lamb carefully, while candlelight flickered against crystal glasses and silver dishes filled with potatoes, buttered carrots, warm bread, and dark berry sauce. Finally, Isolde spoke quietly. Who was Lenora? The effect was immediate. The Duke's wineglass slipped from his fingers and shattered violently against the floor. Red wine spread across the carpet like blood. Every servant froze. Leontius stared at her silently. For the first time since their marriage began, genuine shock crossed his face. The room felt suddenly cold. "I found her name today, in your study." The Duke said nothing for several seconds. Then he placed his napkin down with slow precision.
She was my first wife.
You told me you had never married before.
She died many years ago.
How?
She became unwell.
She became unwell. Nothing more. No grief, no details. Just those words. And in that terrible moment, Duchess Isolde Renmere realized the horrifying truth. Everything happening to her now had happened to another woman before.
Morwenna returned to Blackmere Castle 2 days later after receiving Isolde's letter. This time she arrived without gifts or polite conversation. The moment she entered the castle foyer and saw her sister's face clearly beneath the morning light, concern darkened her expression immediately. "You look thinner," she whispered while removing her gloves. Isolde forced a smile she no longer felt. "I haven't been sleeping well." That evening they remained alone inside the Duchess's chambers while snow drifted softly beyond the tall bedroom windows. The fire burned low beside untouched tea trays and folded blankets. For the first time, Isolde told her everything: the sleeping tea, the missing memories, the medical records, Lenora. Morwenna listened silently, her face growing paler with each word. "And you still stay here?" she finally asked. "What choice do I have?" Isolde whispered. "If I leave now without proof, he will convince everyone I'm unstable." Morwenna looked around the enormous room uneasily. "Then we find proof." The investigation began quietly after that. During the following days, the sisters searched parts of Blackmere Castle rarely used anymore. Old storage halls gathered dust beneath covered furniture, while unused guest chambers smelled of cold stone and fading lavender polish. Most servants avoided those sections entirely, especially the east wing. The corridor leading there remained locked behind heavy iron doors near the upper staircase. Whenever Isolde asked staff members about it, they immediately changed the subject or claimed the rooms were unsafe due to structural damage. But one rainy afternoon, Morwenna noticed something strange. Fresh footprints. Someone still entered the east wing regularly. That night, after dinner, while Leontius remained occupied with estate guests downstairs, the sisters returned, carrying a lantern and a ring of keys quietly borrowed from the housekeeper's office. The third key opened the iron door. Cold air rushed from the dark corridor immediately. Dust covered the floorboards, yet signs of recent movement remained visible beneath the lantern glow. Portraits lined the walls beneath white sheets, while old chandeliers hung silently overhead. At the far end of the corridor, Isolde discovered the nursery. The room stopped her completely. Tiny wooden horses still rested beside the fireplace. Children's books remained stacked carefully near the bed. Pale curtains covered the windows, while a layer of dust softened every surface like snow. Nothing had been touched in years, yet the room did not feel abandoned. It felt preserved. Morwenna slowly opened one of the drawers beneath the wardrobe. Inside rested bundles of letters tied neatly with faded ribbon. Lenora's handwriting covered every page. Isolde sat trembling beside the nursery window while reading them one by one. At first, the letters sounded ordinary: loneliness, insomnia, headaches. Then, gradually, the words changed. "I misplaced an entire afternoon today. The servants look frightened whenever I forget things. Leontius insists I rest more. And then, he watches me drink the tea every night." Isolde's hands turned ice cold. Another letter described waking inside unfamiliar rooms without remembering how she arrived there. One page mentioned bruises along Lenora's wrists. Another described servants whispering that the Duchess was becoming unstable. The similarities became impossible to ignore. By the final letter, the handwriting shook violently across the page. "I no longer trust my own mind." Morwenna stared at her sister in horror. "He did this before." Isolde said nothing, because deep inside herself, another realization hurt even more. Leontius had not chosen her because he loved her. He had chosen her because she resembled Lenora. The same dark hair, the same quiet temperament, the same ability to trust him completely. For the first time since her marriage began, Isolde understood she had never truly been special to him at all. She had simply been another woman he believed he could control. The thought hollowed something inside her.
The following evening, Isolde accidentally overheard the final truth. She had been walking toward the library when voices drifted through the partially opened study door. Leontius stood inside, speaking quietly with the household physician. "She remembers more lately," the doctor warned nervously. "Then increase the dosage. She's already weak." A pause followed. Then Leontius answered with terrifying calmness, "She does not need to survive." The words destroyed whatever remained inside Isolde's heart. For several seconds she could not breathe, not because she doubted him anymore, because she finally understood there was nothing left to save. No misunderstanding, no illness, no tragic distance between husband and wife. Only manipulation, only control, only a man calmly discussing whether she lived or died. That night, Isolde did not cry. That frightened her most. Instead, she sat silently before the bedroom mirror while the fire crackled behind her. Her reflection looked unfamiliar now. The frightened woman who once defended Leontius to everyone around her felt very far away. When the Duke entered carrying the tea later that evening, she smiled softly and thanked him exactly the way she always had. Then she waited patiently until he left the room. Afterward, she poured the liquid into the fire. The flames hissed sharply. For the first time, the act no longer felt desperate. It felt deliberate, careful, cold. And slowly, quietly, Duchess Isolde Renmere began planning revenge. Days passed. Leontius grew increasingly relaxed around her, convinced the tea continued weakening her mind exactly as intended. But one evening during dinner, while lifting his wineglass toward his lips, the Duke's hand trembled suddenly. Only slightly, almost invisible, yet Isolde noticed immediately. And so did he.
Winter settled heavily over Blackmere Castle during the following weeks. Snow buried the gardens so deeply that servants disappeared almost entirely from the outer grounds, except for stable boys carrying firewood and workers clearing paths between the estate buildings. Inside the castle, enormous fireplaces burned day and night, while thick velvet curtains shut out the gray skies beyond the windows. And slowly, almost invisibly, Duke Leontius Veilcrest began falling apart. At first, the changes were small enough to dismiss. He misplaced estate documents repeatedly. During breakfast conversations, he occasionally paused mid-sentence, searching for words that refused to come. Twice, he forgot scheduled meetings with neighboring landowners, something previously unimaginable for a man obsessed with control and routine. Then, the mood swings began. One morning, a servant accidentally spilled coffee near the study entrance, and Leontius reacted with such sharp anger that the young man nearly dropped to his knees, apologizing. Minutes later, the Duke seemed unable to remember why he had become upset at all. Another evening, he accused the kitchen staff of changing the dinner menu, despite personally approving it earlier that afternoon. The castle servants noticed. So did Isolde. But unlike before, she no longer moved through Blackmere Castle frightened and uncertain. The fog inside her mind had disappeared completely, now that the poisoned tea no longer touched her lips. Her thoughts felt clear again, steady, controlled. The frightened Duchess who once begged silently for affection had begun disappearing, and Leontius sensed it. That was what unsettled him most. One evening, while they dined alone beside the western fireplace, the Duke studied her unusually carefully across the table. Candlelight flickered against silver dishes filled with roasted pheasant, potatoes glazed in butter, warm bread, and dark berry wine. "You seem better lately," he said suddenly. Isolde cut slowly into her food. "Do I? You sleep more peacefully." "I suppose I do." His eyes lingered on her face longer than necessary. Not loving, watching. That same night, for the first time since introducing the sleeping tea, Leontius remained inside the bedroom after bringing the tray. Usually he kissed her forehead and disappeared quietly into his study. Tonight he stayed.
The silver tray rested near the fireplace, while snowstorm winds scraped against the castle walls outside. "You forgot your medicine yesterday morning," he said calmly. "I'm sorry." "You must be more careful." Isolde nodded softly while hiding the cold tension tightening inside her chest. Then the Duke lifted the porcelain teacup himself and handed it directly to her. But earlier that evening, while preparing for bed, Isolde had quietly emptied the original tea into the wash basin and replaced it with plain water before he entered the room. Now she raised the cup slowly toward her lips while Leontius watched, waiting. The silence between them felt suffocating. Finally, she swallowed. The Duke relaxed almost immediately afterward, not visibly, but enough for her to notice. That tiny reaction confirmed everything again. He still believed the poison controlled her, and he needed to believe it. The following days became increasingly tense. Leontius began forgetting conversations entirely. Twice he asked Isolde the exact same question within hours. Another evening, during dinner, he reached for a wineglass already sitting in his hand. The first time it happened, embarrassment crossed his face. The second time, fear did. Meanwhile, Isolde grew calmer with each passing day. She no longer cried alone at night, no longer searched desperately for traces of the man she once loved. That grief had hardened into something quieter now. Observation, patience, calculation. Then came the formal dinner. Several neighboring aristocrats arrived at Blackmere Castle, despite the heavy snow, to discuss railway contracts and estate investments. Servants moved constantly through the enormous dining hall, carrying roasted lamb, buttered vegetables, crystal glasses, polished silver trays, and steaming bowls of onion soup, while orchestral music drifted softly through the room. Isolde wore dark burgundy silk that evening, her hair pinned carefully above her shoulders. For the first time in months, she looked healthy, radiant even, and eventually Leontius noticed. Halfway through dinner, while one of the guests spoke about land negotiations in York, the Duke suddenly stopped listening. His eyes lifted toward Isolde and froze, really froze, because sitting across from him was not the weak, confused woman he believed he controlled anymore. Her skin no longer looked pale. The shadows under her eyes had vanished. Her expression remained calm, clear, alive. Meanwhile, his own fingers trembled visibly beside the wineglass. A strange silence settled over him. Then, slowly, horrifying understanding crossed his face. Isolde saw the exact moment it happened, the exact moment the pieces finally connected inside his mind. The tea, the symptoms, the memory lapses, not hers, his. "You," he whispered quietly. No one else at the table understood the meaning behind that single word, but Isolde did, and so did Leontius. For several endless seconds they stared at one another across candlelight and silver plates, while conversations continued softly around them. Neither moved, neither looked away. The Duke finally understood the truth. His wife had never been drinking the poison. He had. Too late. That night, Blackmere Castle felt colder than ever before. Isolde lay motionless beneath the blankets, pretending sleep, while snowstorm winds rattled the windows violently outside. Then, sometime after midnight, the bedroom door slammed open. Leontius entered, breathing heavily, and without speaking a single word, the Duke began tearing through their chambers, searching everything in sight.
The storm arrived before sunset. By evening, Blackmere Castle stood buried beneath violent snow and screaming wind, powerful enough to shake the ancient windows. Servants hurried through corridors carrying extra firewood, while stable hands fought to secure frightened horses outside. The roads leading away from the estate disappeared completely beneath snowdrifts. No one was leaving Blackmere that night. Which was exactly why Isolde sent the evidence before the storm worsened.
Near dusk, she slipped quietly into the lower servants' corridor, carrying a sealed package hidden beneath her coat. Inside rested copies of Lenora's letters, the medical reports, and written statements prepared carefully over the past week with Morwenna's help. The stable boy, waiting near the rear entrance, looked terrified accepting it.
You understand where this goes?
Yes, Your Grace.
To the magistrate directly. No one else.
The boy nodded quickly before disappearing into the storm with the package hidden beneath his jacket. For the first time in months, Isolde felt something close to relief. If the documents reached York safely, Leontius could no longer bury the truth. But someone inside Blackmere Castle betrayed her. An hour later, the bedroom door burst open so violently it slammed against the wall hard enough to rattle the mirrors. Isolde stood instantly from the fireplace chair. Leontius entered, breathing heavily, snow melting across his dark coat, while one of Lenora's letters trembled in his hand. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The storm roared outside, the fire crackled sharply between them, and for the first time since their marriage began, the Duke no longer looked controlled. He looked unraveling. "You entered the East Wing," he said calmly.
The East Wing.
The calmness frightened her more than shouting. Yes, his jaw tightened. You searched my study. Yes, you sent someone away from this castle tonight. Isolde's silence answered him. Leontius laughed softly then, though nothing about the sound carried humor. You should have left things alone. The words settled heavily inside the room. Isolde stared at the man she once loved more than herself and realized she no longer recognized him at all.
Did you poison Lenora too?
The Duke looked toward the fire. For several seconds, only the storm answered. Then, finally, he spoke.
State was collapsing.
His voice sounded distant now, almost exhausted.
Blackmere was drowning in debt long before you arrived here. Factories failed, investments disappeared, everyone expected perfection from me while everything beneath this castle rotted.
That doesn't answer my question.
Leontius looked back at her slowly.
She became difficult. She discovered the financial records. She stopped trusting me. She threatened to leave.
And so you poisoned her!
The Duke's expression darkened instantly.
I tried helping her at first.
Helping, the word nearly made Isolde sick.
She grew unstable, paranoid, emotional, exactly like you.
You made her that way!
Leontius slammed the letter onto the table suddenly. I gave both of you everything. His voice echoed violently through the chambers. Outside, lightning flashed white across the snow-covered windows. The Duke paced toward the fireplace, his movements restless now.
You think you understand sacrifice? Do you know what it means carrying an estate like Blackmere alone? Watching generations of power collapse while everyone waits for you to save them?
Isolde backed slowly away from him.
You chose women you thought you could control.
I chose women who became impossible. The
You
words
poisoned me.
horrified her,
You
not
stopped being
because
the
he
woman I
whispered
married
them,
after the
because he
accident.
believed them. You poisoned me, she said quietly. Leontius stared at her without guilt. You stopped being the woman I married after the accident. The room fell silent. Then, slowly, carefully, Isolde asked the question she had feared for months. The staircase. For the first time, uncertainty crossed his face, only briefly.
staircase.
You were supposed to survive.
survive.
Her breath
pushed
caught
me.
painfully.
You were becoming
pushed me. You were becoming suspicious already. The confession shattered something final inside her. Every memory of tenderness suddenly felt poisoned too. The dances, the carriage rides, the kisses before sleep, all of it now carried something rotten beneath the surface. Leontius stepped toward her again. You could have stayed obedient, he whispered. You could have lived comfortably here. Isolde's voice trembled with disbelief.
You murdered your wife.
And you forced me to become this man!
The scream exploded from him so suddenly, the windows seemed to shake with it. For the first time, the mask cracked completely. Not the elegant duke, not the composed aristocrat admired across England, just a frightened man unraveling beneath his own lies. Then, suddenly, he lunged toward her. Isolde stumbled backward, just as his hand slammed violently against the chair beside her. The force overturned slammed the small table near the fireplace, scattering books and glass across the carpet. She ran, out into the corridor. The castle stretched endlessly dark around her, while storm winds howled through distant halls. Behind her, the Duke chased her through Blackmere, with heavy footsteps echoing against stone floors. Servants opened doors briefly, before disappearing again in terror. Isolde raced past portraits, staircases, and candle-lit corridors, while the Duke shouted her name behind her. The pursuit ended near the east staircase, the exact place where everything began. Breathing hard, Isolde turned just as Leontius reached her. Snowstorm light flashed through the tall windows behind him, and fury and panic twisted across his face completely now. Then, suddenly, another voice cut through the darkness. "That's enough, Your Grace." Leontius froze. From the shadows beyond the corridor, several figures stepped forward slowly, a magistrate and officers. The corridor fell silent, except for the storm. Snow hammered violently against the tall east wing windows, while the magistrate stepped forward, holding several folded documents beneath his coat. Two officers remained behind him, their dark uniforms wet from the journey through the blizzard. Leontius stared at them without moving. For a moment, the Duke looked less like a powerful aristocrat and more like a man waking from a nightmare too late. "What is the meaning of this?" he asked quietly. The magistrate's expression remained cold. "We received evidence concerning the death of Duchess Lenora Veilcrest and attempted harm at your current wife." Leontius laughed once beneath his breath. Disbelief, not amusement. You rode through a storm based on accusations from an unstable woman? At those words, something unexpected happened. One of the servants stepped forward from the corridor shadows, then another, then another. Faces that had lowered themselves in fear for years slowly emerged into the candlelight surrounding the staircase. The elderly housekeeper spoke first. "Her Grace is not unstable." Leontius turned sharply toward her. Shock crossed his face. The woman had served Blackmere Castle for nearly 30 years, yet now she refused to look away from him. "She begged us for help," the housekeeper whispered. "None of us were brave enough." A stable hand stepped forward next, then one of the maids. Fear still lingered inside them, but something stronger had finally replaced it. The truth. The magistrate unfolded the documents carefully. Lenora's letters, medical reports, estate records, everything. Leontius watched the evidence in silence while the storm screamed around Blackmere Castle like something alive. And slowly, for the first time in his life, the Duke realized his power was gone. No title could bury this, no wealth could silence it, no charm could save him now. The officers approached carefully.
"Your Grace,
Your Grace,"
you
one
must
of them
come with
said
us."
quietly, "you must come with us." For several seconds, Leontius remained perfectly still. Then his eyes shifted toward Isolde, and something frightening passed across his face again. Not rage, desperation. "You ruined everything," he whispered. Isolde looked at him calmly. "No," she answered softly, "you did." The officers reached for him, and suddenly the Duke shoved one of them violently aside. Chaos exploded through the corridor. Servants screamed. One candlestand crashed against the floor. Then Leontius ran, straight through the castle entrance and into the storm. The officers cursed before chasing after him, while snow blasted through the open doors into the foyer. Isolde followed several steps behind, clutching the railing tightly as freezing wind cut through the corridor. Outside, Blackmere Castle had nearly disappeared beneath the blizzard. Snow covered the grounds in violent white waves, while the frozen lake beyond the gardens glimmered faintly beneath moonlight and storm clouds. Leontius sprinted toward it desperately. His dark coat whipped behind him, while officers shouted through the wind, but the Duke never stopped running. Perhaps he already understood prison would destroy him long before any sentence could. Perhaps he could not survive watching the world see him powerless. Or perhaps madness had finally consumed the man who spent years trying to control everyone around him. The ice groaned loudly beneath his boots as he reached the center of the lake. Then it cracked. The sound echoed sharply through the storm. Leontius froze too late. A second fracture split violently beneath him before the frozen surface collapsed completely. The Duke disappeared instantly into the black water below. For several terrifying seconds, one hand reached upward through shattered ice. Then the lake swallowed him whole. Silence followed. Only snow continued falling across the dark water. The officers searched for hours. By dawn, the storm finally weakened enough for workers to recover the body from beneath the ice. News of the scandal spread across England within days. Newspapers filled entire front pages with details from Blackmere Castle. The story of the sleeping Duchess shocked the country completely. Journalists crowded outside the estate gates, while politicians quietly distanced themselves from the Veilcrest name. The investigation into Lenora's death reopened immediately. This time, the truth could no longer be buried. Her letters became public evidence. Doctors testified. Servants spoke openly about years of fear inside the castle. And at last, Lenora Veilcrest was no longer remembered as a woman who lost her mind. She was remembered as a victim. Meanwhile, Isolde remained inside Blackmere Castle through the remainder of winter. At first, many expected her to abandon the estate entirely. Instead, she transformed it. The sealed east wing reopened for the first time in years. Dust-covered rooms filled with light again, while workers restored the old nursery carefully piece by piece. Months later, the room reopened as a memorial library dedicated to women trapped inside abusive homes and manipulative marriages. Shelves replaced old furniture, while Lenora's restored portrait hung quietly beside the window overlooking the frozen cliffs. The castle itself changed too. The fear disappeared first, then the silence. Servants who once walked carefully through the corridors began laughing openly again. Villagers returned to the estate gardens during festivals and holidays. Children played near the lake no one mentioned anymore. And slowly, Blackmere stopped feeling haunted. One evening, nearly a year later, Isolde stood alone beside the nursery window when snow drifted softly across the cliffs beyond the estate. The room behind her glowed warmly beneath candlelight, peacefully. For the first time in years, the castle no longer felt like a prison. She thought about the woman she used to be then, the Duchess who waited awake for her husband late into the night, the woman who blamed herself for losing his affection, the wife who defended him even while he destroyed her slowly. That version of Isolde felt impossibly distant now, because the frightened Duchess who once begged desperately for love inside Blackmere had become something else entirely. She became the woman who survived him.